So what is a clinical trial? Well, it is a form of experiment, and it's to evaluate a medical intervention in the provision of healthcare. Now, what that medical intervention can be is all sorts of things. Most common clinical trials that people are aware of involve drugs, but it can be a clinical trial related to an operation or a different way of doing an operation, or indeed any other intervention, for example, exercise. And we'll come on to a clinical trial in bladder cancer that's related to using exercise as an intervention a bit later on. So I'm just going to go through the components of a trial and what they kind of mean, and to try and give you a flavor of all that's involved with clinical trials research. So when you have a title for a clinical trial, the title really should describe what the study is. And there's this, and it's really the population, the sort of people that are going to go into that clinical trial, the intervention, which is the thing that you're doing. You're then comparing the intervention with the group without the intervention, so those two populations, and then you're looking at those outcomes. So that's a sort of a little acronym called PICO, which really encapsulates sort of most of evidence-based medicine, really, and trying to answer any question if you frame it in a sort of medical context, if you frame it around population, what you do to them, how do you compare them, and what are the outcomes. So it's a nice sort of simple way to look at clinical trials. So we have aims, objectives, and hypotheses, and they're all slightly different things. The aims is really what we're trying to do with the trial. So it's a very sort of general idea what the trial's about. And then objectives should be really, really specific so that you can identify what they are before you do your trial. And then also, so then you'll know if you've actually answered any questions at the end of your trial. And the hypotheses are just specific predictions that you've made that you're going to try and test in the study that you're doing. Okay, so they all mean slightly different things, but they're all around the same thing. And many people get confused between what's an aim and what's an objective. So in terms of study design, as I say, there are many different sorts of trials, but you may have heard these words bandied around. It's a phase 1 trial or a phase 2 trial. And really, it's just the size of the trial and the design of the trial is more around what sort of question it's really trying to answer. So a phase 1 study is a very early study in some intervention that may not have been used before or tested very widely. And that's really just to look at feasibility. Is this actually an option to use this thing? Is this going to be of help? Is it going to help people? So they tend to be small studies. You may have heard about the small studies with when they're using new vaccines for COVID-19, for example. So they'd start off with a phase 1, often in volunteers or a few patients or some of these other studies. And if there seems like there's a signal that things are working and it's tolerable and you can do it, then you might move on to a phase 2. And so a phase 2 study involves more people as a rule, something between 30 and 300. That's a real ballpark sort of estimate. And that's to see, is there actually any activity from the thing that you're doing? Does the exercise get people back to, back out of hospital quicker? Or does the drug, this drug in the bladder cancer at all, does it have some role in it? And then the phase 3 trials are when you're comparing one treatment, usually the best treatment you have, with another treatment that you hope will be better. So that's really looking for effectiveness. And you actually need far more patients to actually answer those questions. So those are phase 3 trials. And we do lots of things in clinical trials to try and actually get the truth. And often it's really hard to get the truth in medicine. And nearly all the time, we don't know nearly as much as we'd like to. And there are a few tricks you can use in clinical trials to reduce the incidence of bias. So bias is or anything that's going to adversely influence the results and stop you from finding truth. And something to help with avoiding that is something called randomization, where if you allow doctors to put patients into groups in trials, they'll always pick the ones that they want to do well for the thing that they think is most likely to work. So you can't actually get people to remove their own bias. If you spent 20 years researching some drug, you want it to work so much that you almost can't help yourself. So the point of randomization is so that it's taking that intervention from the people running the trial out of the system. And blinding does the same thing. Now, you can't always blind in trials, but by blinding trials, it means that the investigators who are trying to find out whether something works or not don't actually know which one the patients are getting, so that doesn't introduce bias. And a double-blind trial, you may have heard of that, is when neither the investigators nor the patients know. And the reason for that is sometimes just by taking part in a trial, you can do better because you think you better You think you're going to do better with a new drug, and actually that affects how you respond to the questions and indeed how you respond to other things, something called the Hawthorne effect, which I'll mention in a bit. So there's a number of things you try and do to avoid bias, but generally speaking, in terms of what decides what treatment's better than another, it's prospective randomized clinical trials. So prospective just means, as opposed to looking back and seeing what happened when a whole load of people got one treatment or another, you're starting out with a carefully formulated question and saying, what's going to happen if I do this or if I don't do this? And you try and control everything else to keep everything else the same. And you just change one thing. And then you look at those that intervention moving forwards, and you compare the outcomes and you see whether you've got a difference. The population is just who you're going to study in the trial. So there's no, you can't do a trial on drugs for bladder cancer in patients with lung cancer, for example. So you've got to be very specific about which patients you choose, because if you have too many different things going on at the same time, for example, patients who've had other cancers or other things in the past, then you may end up not getting a truthful result or not getting any result at all. The intervention is literally what it is, whatever you're doing that you're testing. So as I mentioned, that's either a drug or an operation or something else like exercise. What setting is the trial in? You need to be sure that you know what sort of, where that sort of population lives. Is it going to be in a hospital? Is it going to be in the community? And then you need to be very clear about outcome measures. So your outcome measures are essentially how you decide whether anything's happened or not. And they can, and so when you're designing the trial, you need to be quite specific about what you're going to be looking at the end of the trial. These are all words that you may have heard bandied around about clinical trials. So feasibility is just really, can it be achieved? And sometimes you'll do a separate trial before your big trial just to check that it is actually possible. So we were talking about phase 1 studies. They're often feasibility and tolerability trials. And then the importance of statistics. So without carefully looking at the numbers, you can't actually make any reasonable commentary about what's happened. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but there's something called power, the statistical power of your study. And that's just simply a way to work out how many measurements you need to take in order to get an answer about whichever question that you're asking. And then there are other statistics that you apply to see if the answers that you found are real, and you look at the data in various sorts of ways. And then you have to actually apply whether or not the result that you've found, it might have one number's bigger than another number, but does that actually mean anything? So there's a concept of statistical significance is really, well, is the big enough difference for it to say, well, yes, that's real. That is because of the new drug that we tried, or that is because of this new intervention. And just by convention, not by any, we accept the fact that if there's the chance of it happening by chance, if you follow me, is less than 5%, then you would say that that was statistically significant. But that's really an arbitrary number. It depends how certain you want to be about your result. So that's quite a bit about the detail of clinical trials. I'm just wondering, actually, Kristen, it might be better to maybe we'll take questions at the end. Maybe we'll just keep going. So how do you get recruited to a clinical trial? There's a number of ways this can happen. You may be approached by a doctor or nurse as something relevant to the ongoing care that you're receiving, whatever treatment you're having. Sometimes trials are advertised, and sometimes they're open to volunteers or open to people who have a group of symptoms that the investigators want to test an intervention to find out about. So, for example, if you have bowel problems, then you might see a sign up in the doctor's surgery. Do you have bowel symptoms? Are you interested in this study that's trying to do A and B? And then you could be in touch that way, and then they'd screen you and see if you had the right characteristics, if you're in the right population to go into that trial. Some trials are advertised in the media. It's quite hard to get your trial mentioned in the media. We go to all sorts of lengths to do that sometimes, but it's another way in which you can hear about these. And sometimes, very occasionally, consumers will hear about a clinical trial in the media and actually directly contact the team to see if they're appropriate to take part. Often an easier way is to first go to your own doctor, your GP or your specialist and say, well, what about this trial I've heard about? Would I be able to go into that? Sometimes people hear about them from cancer trials like ANZUP, and I'm going to mention ANZUP a lot because it's the main clinical trials group involved in urogenital cancers, which is obviously my interest as a urologist, and particularly bladder cancer. And we have a lot of information on our website about the various trials. And also we run community engagement forums or fora, perhaps is the correct term, at all of our annual meetings and at other times as well. to give consumers a chance to come and ask questions about clinical trials, to try and spread the word, if you like, about the importance of clinical trials, and also to find out the nitty-gritty about individual ones that might be of interest. And then, of course, most clinical trials nowadays, most properly run clinical trials will actually be registered with clinicaltrials.gov, which is an international clinical trials registry based in America. And you can just go to the website and search for trials in any area and see what's happening. So what are the benefits of joining a trial? So at the top of my list, I put altruism, and I don't know. I mean, I think maybe this will be something interesting to hear from the discussion, but certainly by entering a clinical trial, you're in a unique opportunity to actually help find something else out. So, and sometimes people see taking part in a clinical trial as a way of there being something good out of something that's generally bad that's happening to them, whether they've got a disease, a malignancy, or something else. But it's one positive aspect that you can be doing something proactive that, you know, whilst it may not help you as an individual in a great way, you know that in the future, it'll make sure that treatment decisions are better for people who follow you. Trials can provide access to treatments that you wouldn't otherwise be able to access. That may be a drug treatment that's being tested only in the context of a clinical trial, and it may be a drug that's only otherwise available at a very outlandish cost. And obviously, there are certain situations where taking part in a trial can be useful from that perspective. And in terms of specific advantage, well, generally speaking, people who take part in clinical trials do really well. We know that the outcomes for any one intervention, any drug or any treatment, any operation, they're actually better when they're done in the context of a clinical trial than tends to happen in the real world. And that's for all sorts of reasons. Part of it's to do with a very select group that take part in trials. Some of it's to do with the bias towards only selecting patients for trials that are likely to do better. That's true. But also there are extra checks and extra resources which are thrown at people in clinical trials. We're in a very unusual situation at the moment with the BCG mitomycin trial, where there's so little BCG in Australia that one of the best ways to actually make sure you get BCG is to participate in the trial, which that's not an ideal situation at all, but it's just an example of one situation where trials can be advantageous to take part in. And then there's this thing called the Hawthorne effect. And I've always used this as a way of describing why people do better in clinical trials than the general population. But actually, it's more of a specific phenomenon where if you're measuring something, people modify their behavior because they're being measured. Now, sometimes that modification of behavior might be beneficial, maybe turning up to more appointments, or maybe helping you to be motivated to do well. All sorts of subtle things that impact on how well people do when they're undergoing treatment. And what about the negative aspects of joining a clinical trial, and how are people who take part in trials protected from coming to any harm? So there's this concept of clinical equipoise, and essentially equipoise means that the best time to have a clinical trial is where there is actually no certainty over whether one treatment is better than the other. And you could make a strong case that if that situation exists, you should really encourage everyone who's faced with that treatment decision where there's no evidence that one's better than the other to take part in a trial in order to make sure that in the future you know which one is better than the other. But there are negative aspects. Sometimes there can be costs incurred. And if you take part in a trial, you should ask people to be really upfront about any extra travel, how much time it's going to take. It may just be the hassle of being in a clinical trial. I took part recently in the BRACE trial, which is one of these COVID-19 trials looking at the role of BCG to stop you from getting COVID. It's been run mainly amongst healthcare professionals. And it does take a certain amount of time, and you have to answer emails, and there's an app and things. Not a great deal of hassle, but it's certainly something that may be a negative component depending on what else you're doing. There shouldn't be issues about data and privacy, but clearly in order for someone to measure what's happening to you, they need to record data about you. Usually most data is so well protected in clinical trials compared to what we all allow to be ripped off our smartphones and from our Google accounts every day. But in any case, there is a potential drawback. And And then, of course, there are the real material risks and harms of whatever it is that the trial's doing. So, you know, if you're having a trial which is randomizing you to a new drug, then that new drug may have side effects. It may have toxicity that's unknown. And sometimes, even though clinical trials are performed very carefully, it is possible that things could happen where there's a risk, and all of those risks should be very clearly declared and written down in the patient information and consent form. And this feeling of, am I being a guinea pig? And this is a really difficult question, I think, because in some ways the thing about a clinical trial is that you're choosing to accept something to happen to you by chance, and that's sometimes a very difficult thing to get your head around. But if there really is clinical equipoise, if you really don't know whether one treatment is better than the other, then it's very hard it's very easy rather to say, well, that's a situation where if we can have a clinical trial here, we can really answer an important question. And what is there to protect patients from coming to harm in clinical trials? Well, the first thing is the ethics committee, and they really go through any trial protocol with a fine tooth comb and try and draw out any possible extra risks that have been overseen, make sure that everything's very clearly written on the patient information and consent form, and just absolutely ensure that there are no unforeseeable harms that haven't been thought about by the investigators in their excitement to try and find some new treatment or drug. With drug trials, there's nearly always an independent drug safety monitoring board. So this is a basic group of people who aren't involved with the trial. And it's better not to have the investigators, because in their enthusiasm to show that something's going terribly well, they may not be quite so scrutinizing about any signals about safety or data. So that group of clinicians that oversees the trial are not involved in the trial, and they have no direct relation to it. And of course, you can drop out of a trial at any time. It won't prejudice your future care. It's entirely voluntary. And sometimes of course, you talk about the risks of a study drug or this drug versus this drug. But of course, there are material risks in not taking those interventions from the disease that's presenting, which is why you're in that clinical situation in the first place.